This year is being given in memory of my beloved parents, my father, my teacher, Tzvi Hirsch ben Shmuel Galea Kohen, Ruth bat Chaim Chayimela bat Harav Shlomo Kohen, and they always came to these lectures in Yerushalayim. And because they were in English, they enjoyed it very much. About 27 years ago, at a Passover Seder, my son Hillel asked me a very important question. And Hillel, as all of my children, lives in a frat, and has given me a wonderful daughter, his wife, and 4 grandchildren. My eldest grandson from Hillel studies with me every week, Moren Bochim. At his request, he's 15 years old. He's gone through Nietzsche, he's gone through Yeshayahu Leibovitz. He's a big Rambam fan. And for me, it's a pleasure to learn with him. His father always asked me very provocative questions. So 27 years ago, Hillel said, Abba, I don't understand the whole beginning of the Seder. Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, until Yitzhak. Can't we have one evening of relaxation on Zman Chilutenu? Why isn't there an evening of Zula? You know what Zula is? Zula is an Israeli slang word. I don't know what it comes from. It sounds African. But just to let yourself go. You know, he said, Abba, not to be square, you know, maybe a little hashish together with wine. And I have freedom. I'd like to try to answer this question. 27 years later. I'd like to try to answer this question by attempting to understand Chilut, Zman Chilutenu, the time of our freedom, and what freedom means from a Jewish perspective. Thank you very much. It's fascinating that there are 3 different words that we use in Hebrew or Hebrew Aramaic for this word freedom. Chovesh, Dror, and Chilut. Chovesh is usually translated as free, and probably would seem to be closest to what Hillel wanted to find on the Pesach Seder. However, its place in the Chovesh, we have in the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, when the slave leaves his master at the end of 6 years, Chovshi Chinam, with absolutely no longer any obligation. So one might perhaps translate Chofesh Chavshi as Zula. Do whatever you want. But there's something fundamentally wrong with this. First of all, because when people are free to do whatever they want, more often than not, that turns into total degeneration, alcohol, drugs, orgies, things that are not very positive. And even if it's not as bad as that, you know, the people are usually most tired after they retire and don't have an office to go to. I know that when I'm in the middle of a project, I could work 18 hours a day and not get tired. People who have nothing to do can yawn all day long. And I happen to be a very real devotee of Viktor Frankl and the psychoanalytic world of logotherapy, who teaches very successfully, I think, that what drives people more than anything else, human beings, is not the will to pleasure, as Freud suggested, or the will to power, as Jung and Adler says, but it's the will to meaning, to significance. People want to feel that they're doing something of significance. And therefore, just Zuma doesn't give it and doesn't do it. And therefore, I would take this Hebrew word chofesh, which is an important word, and I would transpose it a little bit in accordance with the writings of the Maharal and the Rambam. I would use chofesh in the sense of freedom, to b'china chofshit, or the freedom of choice. And this freedom of choice is a cardinal principle of Judaism. God created the human being in his image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. The Tzelem Elokim, according to the Rambam and the Maharal and many others, is expressed mostly in freedom of choice. And the Seforno on the words Kidmutenu, in our image, in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, the Seforno says that the human being has a very special kind of freedom. It's similar to the angels in the sense that the angels can think and can understand and can reason. But it's not similar to the angels because they are functional rather than volitional beings. They're given a function by God to carry out God's will. They don't have the choice not to carry out God's will. They're not people of will or beings of will. They are beings of function. So the human being in this sense is higher than the angels because they have freedom of choice. Now says the Seforno in an amazing passage in Utenu, God does choose. God is completely free. ultimately free. However, God, by definition, cannot choose evil because he is consummate goodness. Hashem Kerachnu B'chai. Says this Inferno in an amazing passage. Only the human being can choose evil and can choose to do that which God doesn't want him to do. The human being alone in the universe has untrammeled and unencumbered freedom of choice. That's his selfish. That makes the human being a creature of will, and his will is exceedingly significant. That's selfish. Now, since free choice is a function of the image of God within us, God challenges the human being. It's very interesting. After it says that God created the human being in his image, it says, let us make the human being. Na'aseh Adam b'tzameinu k'dmutenu. Who is the us? To whom is God speaking? Well, the Ramban, I think, says it best. God is speaking to his creations on the sixth day or sixth epoch. On that day, God made the animals and the beasts, and then the human being. And God says to the animals and the beasts, let us together make the human being. Sounds very similar to Darwin, doesn't it? Let us make the human being in our image and after our likeness. Every human being will be part animal and part God. And the human being will have the choice to decide which aspect of himself he is going to develop. And then God gives the human being a charge to fill the world, to be fruitful and multiply, uredu, and to control animals and beasts, vechishua, and to conquer the physical world. And God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Lo'ovda u'l'shomra, to work it, to develop it, to perfect it, to complete it, and to preserve it. Because you see, as the Bible says in chapter 2 of Genesis, God had prepared everything in the world. But there was no human being to work the land. Because you see, God created an incomplete or imperfect world. Verse in the book of Isaiah 45, chapter 7. God made light, created darkness. Made peace and made evil. Created a world of order, but also chaos. Of good, but also of evil. This comes from the untrammeled freedom of choice that every human being has. To do that which God doesn't want him to do. And that's how an Auschwitz can happen. Yes, God makes promises and guarantees that he will never destroy the world or the Jewish people. And that ultimately, compassionate righteousness and moral justice will triumph. That society will be perfected. And that humanity will be redeemed. But the responsibility to do this is placed upon the human being. So our freedom of choice is very far from Zula, as I mentioned before. God charges the human being with perfecting the world, with choosing the good. That's our function in the world. But we have free choice, chodesh, to accept the challenge or to reject the challenge. That's chodesh. The second word that relates to freedom is dror. And that's in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. The commanding verse is verse 10. V'kidashtem et shnat ha-chamishim shana, you shall sanctify the 50th year. U'keratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, and you shall declare freedom throughout the land. And then comes a picture of the 50th year, the Jubilee year. Yovel. It's a picture of fields filled with produce that everyone can take. It's a picture of no slaves, and everyone returning to his ancestral homestead. All deaths are rescinded. And it's a universal picture. Because v'hechzakta bo ger v'toshav. Not only for Jews, but for all the Gentiles who keep the 7 basic laws of morality. It's an idyllic picture of perfected society. That's dror. And the Ibn Ezra says charmingly that the Hebrew word dror can come from 2 roots. Da, to dwell wherever you want to dwell. If you can dwell anywhere you wish, you're a free person. But the Ibn Ezra adds, there was a bird called dror. And when this bird was its own boss, so to speak, was under its own control, the bird would sing magnificently. But when the bird was captured by another person, it would stop eating until it died. The bird, in effect, said, give me liberty or give me death. It is our song, the song of Israel. It is our song to work towards the perfection of the world. That's the charge that God gave to Abraham. That's why the Jewish people were put on the world. I hate to break it to you. We weren't put on the world in order to eat shalom with tishka or without tishka. We were put on the world to heed God's challenge and attempt to perfect it. And you will become a great nation, God says in Genesis 12, verse 3. And you will bring a blessing to all the families of the earth. Genesis 18, verses 18 and 19. God says, I have chosen him, loved him, pointed him out, Abraham, in order that he may command his children and household after him to go in the ways of the Lord, to do compassionate righteousness and moral justice. That's our task. And the role paints a picture of precisely that. And there's a third word. And that's the word that's most significant in terms of Passover. And that word is chelut. Zman chelutenu. The time of our freedom. So Chovesh is involved with Bechirah Chofshit and freedom of choice. And the role is involved with the ultimate vision of a perfected society. Chelut. What is the source of this word, chelut? Can someone tell me what is the logical word from which chelut emanates? Achrayut. Is it amazing? That's why Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh. There's no language like Hebrew. Achrayut. Chelut comes from achrayut. Freedom means taking responsibility. Freedom is not zula. Freedom is active participation. And active participation, we spoke about Grower, and God placing the human being by the Garden of Eden to work it and perfect it and preserve it. Importance of ecology. Well, achrayut, within that word is also ach and acher. Remember Cain's question to God? Hashomer achi anochi? Am I my brother's keeper? You sure damn are, God answers him. And we are all our brother's keepers. We're supposed to conquer the world. What will give us the power to conquer the world is our composite nature, Naaseh Adam, part animal, part God. First, we have to conquer the animal part within ourselves, and then we have to conquer the animal part of the world. That is a simple task. We can do it because Because Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim vayi adam b'nefesh chaya, because there is a part of God within every single one of us. And the part of God, the Tzelem Elokim, which is the root of all of this, of freedom of choice, of growth, of the 50th Jubilee year. Part of God tells us, just as God created a world, so must we recreate that world in our perfecting of it. And we must recreate ourselves. We have to begin by perfecting as much as we can ourselves before we set out, or at least at the same time that we set out to perfect the world. So that part of God within us tells us that we have the ability, we are empowered to recreate. We are empowered to recreate ourselves. Empowered by God. And we learn from the going out of Egypt, you must love the stranger. Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you look at this word, acharayut. It's ach, my brother, and achir, the stranger. Our responsibility of freedom is to reach out to our brother and to the stranger. And the commanding verse is V'ahavta u'reyacha kamocha. You should love your friend like yourself, reyacha. And the Ibn Ezra correctly notes, who is reyacha? Every single human being, because every single human being is your brother. And there is no real acher, because every acher is really an ach. In English, there's no relationship between brother and stranger in words. But in Hebrew, ach is brother and acher is stranger, because the acher was also your brother. That's the Lashon HaKodesh. And chilut is the freedom to take responsibility, to act by reaching out to brother and stranger, by reaching out and confronting and perfecting each one in his way the world around him. That's precisely the meaning of chilut. The responsibility of chilut, so that you see very, very clearly that it's anything but relaxed zula. It's an awesome and formidable task. But God wouldn't give it to us unless He was certain that we could succeed. And He will be always there to help us succeed. That's what Judaism teaches. The fact that we're part animal and part human is not easy. But you know the prayer, the song of Nachman Ratzlaff, called Olam Kulo Gesher Tzam. I want to change it a little bit. The whole world is a very narrow bridge. Because we're part animal too. The animal part is always ready to get at us. We have to learn how to mediate it and use it properly, sanctify it. But the next phrase is Vayikar, what? Lo lefacher. The essence is not to be afraid. I don't agree. I don't care if you're afraid. Be a little afraid. You should be a little afraid. Some very important people have fallen off. The ikar is lowly pole, not to fall. Not to fall into the abyss. The ikar is to succeed in the task. The ikar is to perfect yourself in the world around you, in whatever way you can. That's Zman Cherutenu. We were freed from Egypt in order to be able to be free, to accept the responsibility of perfecting the world. Now please let me turn to the Exodus itself. That's what the words mean. So we know why we were freed from Egypt, we know what the Jewish mission is. We know what we have to work on, and we know what we have to accomplish. I want to, a little bit more clearly, try to define how we do all of this. Let's go to chapter 14 of the book of Exodus. That's the chapter of the Red Sea, and leading up to the confrontation of the Red Sea. And I think you'll see some very interesting things. And God said to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel. Let them return and encamp before Pi Hachilot, the mouth or the opening or the gates of Haurus, Haurus, one of the most powerful gods, small G-O-D-S, idols of the Egyptian world. Between the tower and the sea, the Red Sea. Before Baal Zephon was a gigantic statue idol from the north. And let them encamp near the sea. Very strange. This geographical description is repeated again in this chapter. And the place of the Red Sea where a great miracle is about to happen is very, very much bound up with idols. Very strange. Why does the Bible have to do this? Why do I need these idolatrous places to describe geographically the place of great Jewish miracles? Let's go on and turn to the Red Sea itself and what's going to be happening there. The king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, hears that the Jews are escaping, the Hebrews are escaping. And he gets into his chariot, takes 600 of the most choice chariots, and other regular chariots, and generals over each group, and chases after the Hebrews. Josephus says that he had 50,000 horsemen and 200,000 infantrymen chasing after the Hebrews. Now you know the Hebrews were panicked. They see the Egyptian hordes are in back of them, and they see the Reed Sea in front of them, and they feel trapped. Ibn Ezra, however, doesn't have much patience for their cries. Ibn Ezra asks the most logical question of all. What were they afraid of? They were 600,000 men. Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they attempt to save their lives through battle? We'll come back to this question. Let's go on with the story. The Jews lift up their eyes. They see the Egyptians trapped. They become very frightened. And they cry out to God. And they say to Moses, weren't there enough graves in Egypt? You had to take us here in order to kill us all? Tov lanu avot et Mitzrayim mimutenu b'midbar. We would rather have died, have worked as slaves in Egypt than die in the desert. It's a very important verse. That's the opposite of the topic of tonight's lecture. Give me liberty or give me that. The Jews said, we should have remained slaves in Egypt. We don't want to die in the desert. Moses says to the Jews, don't be afraid. Stand straight. Wait for the salvation of the Lord. God will do battle for you. You just remain silent. Very comforting. That's verse 14 of chapter 14. Then comes verse 15. God says to Moses, because Moses apparently was praying to God also. God says to Moses, what are you praying to me for, Moses? This is not the time for a lengthy prayer when the Jews are in such trouble. Speak to the children of Israel and tell them to get going, to get moving. I would interpret it to mean either fight the Egyptians or get into the river, into the sea, try to traverse it. But act. Don't stand silently by. Take responsibility. You hear me all right? Yes?
No problem.
Take responsibility. Chayut, achrayut. Act. Now, what kind of sentence is this? God saying to Moses, this is not the time to pray when the Jews are in such terrible trouble. Lo eitata ma'arich tefillah, kasher Yisrael netunim b'tzara. When else should the Jews pray except when they're in terrible trouble? And that's Rashi's words. What can Rashi possibly mean? And you know what they say about the Chachmei Tzfat? In 1948, Tzfat always had people. Anybody here from Tzfat? Tzfat is one of the 4 holy cities. It's a very, very great place. And Tzfat is also the city of mystics and deeply religious Jews. And not known as being practical fighters. So when a news reporter came to Tzfat in 1948 when they won against the Palestinians, The news reporter said, how did you guys win? They said, well, we won in two ways, naturally and supernaturally. Naturally, we sang the songs. Supernaturally, the palmachtim. In other words, there are those who believe it's not the palmach, it's the songs, it's the prayers. Well, obviously, Rashi didn't believe that. Rashi says this isn't the time of prayer when the Jews are in trouble. You're supposed to act. Take responsibility and do something. Well, I would argue that in front of Rashi was a very important Gemara. The Gemara is Masechet Brachot 3a, Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. But before I tell you the Gemara, I want to answer my previous question. Why are we told these places of idolatry? And how do we answer Ibn Ezra's question? Why didn't they fight? And I told you that Pi Chirot, and so most of the biblical interpreters explain it, is the mouth or the gate of the Haurus, Haurus, idol. But you can look at this word a little differently. And you can explain Chirot, Chet Yud Reish Vav Tav, as Pi Chirut, the passageway to freedom, the cusp, at the cusp of freedom. You see, the Jews had just spent 210 years as slaves in Egypt. They were just tasting the beginning of freedom. We've explained freedom, chirut, as achrayut, taking responsibility. Responsibility for yourself and responsibility for others. In order to make the world a more perfect place. But the Jews weren't quite there yet. Didn't quite understand what freedom really meant. Certainly not active freedom of responsibility. And you see, idolatry is very different in Judaism. The idols are created in the image of human beings. They were human beings writ large. Think of the idols on Mount Olympus. Zeus was power writ large. Aphrodite was beauty writ large. Hercules was speed writ large. These idols have all the foibles of human beings. They're jealous, and they're sneaky, and they're greedy. And the structure of idolatry, if you read works like Before History, was one in which people who were afraid of nature and its vagaries would somehow see a world in which these idols ran the world. And all that human beings could do, powerless human beings, was to try to propitiate the gods with gifts and with prayers. But the gods did it all. Judaism is very different. It says that humans are created in the image of God. God is not physical, and God doesn't have physical shortcomings. God is a God of compassion and righteousness and loving kindness and truth. And we have to emulate those characteristics. And if we do that, God tells us that He will empower us to triumph over evil. So it's a whole different structure. Now at this point, the Jews are al pi chilut. They're at the cusp, at the mouth, at the opening of freedom. They haven't tasted real freedom yet. They don't realize that they can act with responsibility. So they're still in the idle mode. Maybe even Moses was still in the idle mode. So he tells them, don't do anything. God will do it for you. God is more powerful than you forgive the idol. So God gets angry at Moses. No. It's a different set of rules now. They're free. They have to act. And they have to learn the importance of acting responsibly. This is not the time to pray. It's the time to act. Let me explain to you an amazing passage in the Talmud. Brachot 3:8. Once Rabbi Yossi, who was a great rabbi of the Mishnah, 2nd century, coming here, after the destruction of the Second Temple, went into one of the ruined synagogues in Jerusalem to pray. Elijah the prophet came to meet him, but when he found out he was in the ruins, he stood outside of that synagogue. When Rabbi Yossi exited, Elijah the prophet asks him, and Elijah the prophet is the expert on redemption. He's the one who will herald the Messiah. Elijah the prophet says to him, what were you doing in the ruins? And Rabbi Yossi said, I was praying. I guess I was praying for redemption. Elijah says, you shouldn't pray on the road. On the road to rebuilding Jerusalem and Israel. You should have been planting. You should have been building. And if need be, you should have been fighting. I was fighting, said Rabbi Yossi. That they would terrorize me. They would drive my shootings. I wouldn't be able to be creative. You shouldn't pray a short prayer. But you shouldn't pray while acting. It's an amazing piece of Gemara. Rabbi Yossi said, I learned 3 things from Elijah the prophet. I learned you're not supposed to go into ruins to pray. I learned you have to pray on the road to redemption and rebuilding. And that when you pray on the road to redemption and rebuilding, it must be a short prayer to leave much more time for the action. This is a very important message for the Haredim. It's a very important message for all of us. God challenges us, and He's waiting for us to act. And when God said, speak to the Jewish people and tell them to get moving, even God was saying, if you're not going to fight, at least prove to me that you're willing to risk your life for freedom because you understand the tremendous importance of freedom. Because that's the expression of God's image. To be able to express yourself and your mission. To be able to make a change. I want to tell you where I learned the most powerful message of Zionism that I ever learned. In 1975, I started spending my summers as a scholar in residence in Kibbutz Ein Surim. Ein Surim started out in Gush Etzion. It was destroyed in 1948 by the Jordanian Legion, together with the other 3 settlements in the Gush. The survivors built kibbutzim, moshavim, around Ashkelon, in that area. Ein Surim is there. And they invited me to be a scholar in residence. I was still living in New York. And I went for 8 summers prior to coming to Israel. The whole idea of the frat began there. Our adopting family was Yehuda and Zahava Naiman, who are still amongst my most beloved friends. I learned all about modern Zionism in Gush Etzion and Zionist history from them. And in their living room, the frat was planned. There was someone who lived there named Mitzari, everyone called him Moshavnik. His father lived in Kfar Hasidim and his father died. And the funeral was in Kfar Hasidim. Most of the kibbutz went, and I also went. In Kfar Hasidim there was a yeshiva. The yeshiva Gedola, yeshiva Gavoha. Right-wing yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva was Rabbi Elia Mishkovsky. Zichrono Livracha. The tahara, the purification of the body, was taking place in the yeshiva building. There was a large plaza outside, and a large gathering for the funeral. 2 groups, very distinct groups. There was the kibbutz group, shorts of the shirt, sandals. And there was the yeshiva group, white shirt, black pants, socks, shoes. The 2 groups didn't speak. I mean, no anger, no, but just each group within itself spoke to each other. Rabbi Mishkovsky, there was a large kind of porch, gesustra, 2nd story of the yeshiva. He came out, he looked over the crowd, and he said in 10 minutes they would begin the funeral, the eulogies. And all of a sudden, he eyed my friend Yehuda Neumann. My friend Yehuda Neumann is a tremendous Talmudic scholar who finishes at least 1 tractate of the Talmud every month. Kibbutz Mitzvah. In the heyday, his heyday, the kibbutz's heyday, he would work for 8 hours and learn Torah for 8 hours. I'm not exaggerating, every day. Anyway, Rabbi Elia Mishkovsky wore his black hat and his black frock, even though it was very hot. He looked out at the crowd and he saw my friend and he said, Yutke, Yutke, das bist du? That's you? Now I had known that my friend Yehuda Neumann studied in the yeshiva in Petach Tikva. Rav Shach was the Rosh Yeshiva then, before he came to college. And Rabbi Mishkovsky was in his class, in the class of Yehuda Neumann. And Ilu means genius. That was the name they gave to my friend Yehuda. And Rabbi Mishkovsky hadn't seen him in decades. Is that you? Yudke Ilu, spoken Yiddish. My friend responded in Hebrew. That's what they used to call me in the yeshiva. You weren't supposed to leave the yeshiva, said Rabbi. I'm sure Rav Shach didn't want you to leave the yeshiva. You would have been a great Rosh Yeshiva had you stayed. Well, said my friend, who was usually very silent and kind of shy, but he said in Hebrew strongly, I still have the letters of Rav Shach telling me to stay. All the rebellious students were around. So I guess he seized an opportunity and he said, those letters will stand as your prosecuting attorney after 120 years when you stand before God's throne. Had you stayed in the yeshiva, you would have been one of the shining Talmudic luminaries. I thought my friend would not respond, but he did, strongly, in Hebrew. He said, and the kibbutz that I helped build, and the wars in which I fought, they will be my defense attorney. And together with the Talmud that I study every day, they will win before God's judgment. Rebellion took a step back. My friend sort of won that round. And Rebellion said, bist geblieben dieselbe Yudke. You're the same Yudke. My friend wouldn't let him get away with it though. He said in Hebrew, no rebellion. You remain the same like when we were together in Petach Tikva in the 1930s. I took note of the Holocaust. I took note of the condition of the Jewish people. I took note of Kol Medinat Israel and the dream of the recreation of the state of Israel. And I decided to create a kibbutz and to fight in the wars, because that's what the times demanded. And that's what human Jewish responsibility demanded. I changed, although I still learn Talmud every day, and hopefully keep all the commandments. It's you who remain the same. That's precisely what the Gemara is saying. It's not the time to pray a long prayer when the Jews are in such trouble. Freedom demands action. That's what the Gemara says. I want to just make a number of closing points. First of all, the difficulty with a slave in servitude is that a slave is not able to express himself, his existential self. He's not able to act responsibly to fulfill his task in life. And servitude damages and sometimes completely destroys the image of God within the human being. And servitude does havoc to two beings, the master as well as the slave. Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And Moses grew up and went out to his brethren, and he saw their suffering. And he saw an ish mitzri beating on an ish ivri. Ish means important personage. And he looked here and there, and he saw there was no ish. And he smote the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. I want to interpret this passage. Moses walked out of Pharaoh's palace, and he went out unto his brethren, the slaves, the Hebrew slaves. He could have paid no attention to them, but he had to act responsibly. He had to reach out. They were both Achim and Achirim, brothers and strangers. He recognized both the Egyptian from his life as an Egyptian as well as the Hebrew, and they were important personages. But when he looked at them carefully, because the Egyptian was beating on the Hebrew, he realized that they had both lost their important personages. It's Elohim. The master, because no human being has the right to lord it over another human being. We are all under God as human beings. And because a slave also loses his status as a personage, the beaten woman who believes that she deserves to be beaten, syndrome. So he saw, as James Baldwin said, I can forgive the whites for enslaving the blacks. I can't forgive the whites for making the blacks think they were worthy of slavery. So Moses says, neither of the two are important personages, not the master and not the slave. And he understood that he had to lead a rebellion against Egypt, which is what he really did, putting his life and the lives of many others on the line. But if you want to keep your Tzalem Elohim, your image of God, you can't be enslaved, and you cannot enslave. Why was Joseph, great personage in the Bible, not one of the patriarchs? There's more written about him than there is about any of the other patriarchs. In chapter 47 of the book of Genesis, we hear an amazing story about Joseph. His economic policies. It's amazing that, why does the Bible tell us his economic policies? What does that have to do with anything in the story of Joseph and his family? It seems totally out of place. But if you look at his economic policies, it's an eye-opener. The Bible explains what he did for Pharaoh. First, he took all money out of circulation. So the Egyptians didn't have any money to pay for food, and they were starving. Then, they gave them their cattle to pay for the food. He took all their cattle. They had no cattle left. And they still needed food. And they said, okay, we'll give you our land and we'll give you ourselves. Let Pharaoh take us as slaves as long as we get bread. And Joseph enslaved the entire Egyptian populace to Pharaoh. He made Pharaoh the greatest totalitarian ruler of his time. owning all the land and all the people. Joseph forgot the legacy of Abraham. God wants compassionate righteousness and moral justice, not slavery. Whether it's enslaving a Jew or enslaving an Egyptian. Therefore, with the morality of the Bible, there arose a king in Egypt who didn't know or didn't love Joseph. And measure for measure, Joseph enslaved the Egyptians. The Egyptians enslaved Joseph's descendants. That's biblical morality. That's the message against slavery. I conclude. Josephus, in the Wars of the Jews, Part 7, Chapter 8, brings an amazing speech by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yair. You know, Second Temple was destroyed. Rabbi Akiva sparked a rebellion with Bar Kokhba, almost won. For 3.5 years, Bar Kokhba won. But then, the Romans brought a great general, Severus, from far away, and we were no match. The last stronghold, Beitar, and specifically Matzada. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yair, not Patrick Henry, was the first one to say, give me liberty or give me death. Josephus brings his speech, one of the most amazing speeches in history. There has now come the time that we are commanded to do with our hands what we know must be done in our hearts. A last-ditch attempt, a last-ditch act of freedom in the face of Roman subjugation. Behold, I believe that God has done for us a tremendous act of righteousness, placing within our hands the possibility of dying the death of courageous free men. A possibility that our brethren did not have because they were ambushed and killed too quickly. We know that tomorrow the Roman legions are going to come, and so our end. We have the possibility of choosing the death of heroes. We, and the beloved in our eyes, our children with us. Therefore, may our women die before they are defiled. May our children die before they taste the taste of slavery. And may we, each one, help his friend to die the death of the brave. We will bring our freedom to the grave. And before we die, we will destroy in fire this entire fortress. I know that the Romans will be very disappointed if they don't take us alive. They'll be very upset that they won't gain booty. We will leave some supplies for them so that they will know that we didn't die of starvation. We died at our own hands. But we have chosen death over life of a slave. Because we understand must remain free to the very end. We are much against slavery. We're facing a world in which the United Nations is allowing slavery to take place in many, many places around the globe. May God grant that the message of our Bible and the message of our people be heard around the globe, and that we understand that no one should have the right to enslave another, and that we dare not rest until we see world freedom and redemption. Chag Sameach. Thank you very much.